So next up on stage are Kåre Aleksander Grundvåg and Arne Skaug Olsen. Kåre is working with non-human sculpture interventions, and part of Arne's work is to, in different ways, attempt to give microorganisms a voice and a political agency. So now we're going to meet them in a conversation about Earthworks. Please.
Tack. Okay. Yeah, super nice to be here. I can't see with the glasses. Thank you to NOBA for bringing us here to engage in, I would say, another conversation, or to continue a conversation. Yeah, so the title of this talk in the program is, as you said, Earthworks in Conversation. And I just want to sort of stress that you know, a good conversation is never scripted, and neither is this one. So we actually don't know where it's going to lead us and where it's going to end. We know when it's going to end, but not where. So are the images rolling? Could you start? Yep. Yeah, they're going to start. So, oh yeah, that's good. That's a good plan. Yeah. Okay. So what you're seeing here on these screens are images from the process of making and the finished installation of Kåre's exhibition Earthworks at Gallery N3 in Bergen. It is a project that is actually still ongoing. It's not finished. So you will see these Kåre sculptures here in sort of not in the making, but in the finished exhibited state, and in a state of actually being alive and growing. But we'll get back to that, I think. So I just want to say a little bit about, or try to zoom out a little bit to give a little bit of context of what this exhibition actually is. So, and I really liked what was said there earlier, that soil is also a cultural archive, because I think that is really a way to sort of like enter into this project. And through the term sites. I mean, a site is a place where something has happened, basically. Something has been going on there that has impacted this place and made it into, or brought it into our culture, in a sense. And this, I think, is one of Kåre's main interests in this project, but maybe not the one that we will talk most about, but I'll just give the context. And it started in Tromsø in 2020, where Kåre made the first version of Earthworks. And that was an installation in a residential area that had been decommissioned, flattened, and subsequently reclaimed by the forest around it, leaving only traces of infrastructure. So what Kåre did there was go into the landscape, select soil samples, process the soil samples, and make sculptures from that soil. And then he brought them back into the landscape or onto the site to further interact and disintegrate back into the site. So I was later on I was invited to curate an exhibition at N3, and my first impulse was to call Kåre and ask if we should do something about like a continuation of this work. So in Bergen we worked for a while, quite a while actually, to find sites that we wanted to bring into this project, and there are 3 sites in Bergen. It's in the Fløyen Mountains and on the Allerekstad Hovedgård, which used to be the seat of the king back into the 5th century, and also a site of a recent flood in Bergen. So those are the sites for the sampling of the soil that was brought into this project. But then, as you can see in the images, they have a particular shape. So these are sculptures that are 3D printed, or that they are 3D printed from that soil that was sampled. So I want to start there and sort of give the word over to Kåre with I have 2 kind of simple questions, so we can start going into the details a little bit. And that is simply why this combination of using soil and 3D printing technology. What is sort of the interest and the impetus behind that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think to say it very simply, I think I've described quite a lot of my work as sort of reevaluating sort of traditional knowledge through the sort of lens of science or technology. And so I think the interesting notion of sort of invoking 3D printing is that it sort of points to something in the future in a way. At least it does sort in a way that in our sort of collective sort of experience, it's connected with something new, with AI, something a bit scary. We don't really know where it's going. And I think that's like an interesting tool to use to sort of, in a way, work with things that maybe are perceived as belonging to the past, in a sense, and to sort of being able to work with it without this sort of falling into sort of this sort of nostalgic traps or ideas which are like frozen, that there's a certain way things should be. So I think that's sort of on a sort of overarching theme, the reason I think it's interesting to work with 3D printing.
So for you, it's a way of escaping nostalgia?
Yeah, you could say so.
Maybe you want to just talk a little bit more about that, or is that?
I think, well, to try to keep it sort of within these frames and these works. I think it's also just a way to, like soil and site and what sort of layers you have in the landscape, like what has been, what is, and what's going to be, and what should be, and what should have been. They're all sort of very charged notions of what the landscape is or should be. And then to be able to try to work with it, which is in a way also not so, nostalgia can be many things, but it can also be of a sort of particular sort of artistic approach in a way. Like you as a subject molding things, like using 3D printer lets you sort of outsource a bit of that subjectivity in a sense, and make it connecting to something other than you as a subject, even though you can never escape that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, well, maybe actually it would be just like useful for everyone here to know a little bit more specifically about what does it actually mean to 3D print with soil. So there's a couple things surrounding that, and that is sort of the kind of like, it's sort of like a DIY hacking of the technology, but also like making it more bioavailable, actually, or sort of like because the thing is that you can talk more about it, but you sort of like transformed yourself also in the gallery into some kind of cyborg, right? In a sense.
Yeah. So I don't know if everyone is familiar, but to give a very like short introduction to sort of the technical aspect of it, you basically mix up a batch of soil, depending a bit on the actual soil, like how much clay or how much organic matter you got in it. There's also other aspects like grain size, so you end up usually sifting it down to a certain size. There's other complicating factors, like if it's a lot of sand, there's a thing if the sand is sort of coarse or rounded. If it's too coarse, it can lock up in the machinery. So there's all this kind of minutiae in sort of technicalities. But basically you have a mixture and you have a pressurized tank, and you press that into something called an extruder, where you can sort of control the output of soil through a nozzle, and then you have a CNC machinery around that controls the nozzle in layers usually, and then you can input digital data usually through G-code to drive the machinery. In the gallery, I had the chance to do something because I really wanted to work in the space. It's also connected to very practical things, that these soil sculptures are a pain in the ass to transport. But it was an idea I had for a long time, and it's also connected to the sort of the complexity of this. And I was sort of imagining myself as part of this machinery, so I basically brought half the printer with me, and my goal was to sort of perform myself the other half. So you could call it sort of a G-code dance or a performance. And in this sort of situation, something I had, it's maybe a bit of a side note, but I think I'll take it anyway. As it kind of hooks into what I said earlier about sort of having something that is less caught up in my subjectivity, but then this came in back in such a big way, and it was sort of musicality that came in, that like being like on beat in a way when you were doing this printing. So it worked quite bad in the daytime because there was so much commotion in the gallery space that you got out of this rhythm. But at night, I could like perform as a machine. So unfortunately, no one could see that. Yeah. But maybe I kind of want to comment a bit more on the sort of foundation here, like the title. Yeah. As you know, the title is Earthworks, and that ties in with the sort of civil engineering concept of preparing ground for construction. And I think it's such a fundamental notion, which you can sort of, you can also go back in time to sort of the formation of what you could call social or urban spaces, any sort of accumulation of energy or perceived value, and not even just in our sort of species, but also in other sort of social or eusocial insects like ants or termites. It's an important function in a sense. So the whole cut and fill, like the foundation of urban spaces, and that also ties in with the sort of the sites we chose both in Bergen and in Tromsø, which is sort of disturbed or used urban spaces. Soil is disturbed, it has many layers of use and not use, and it ties also into this complexity of talking about what is sort of a natural space and what's a disturbed space. Is there something as an undisturbed space? And sort of tying that in with it's been talked about a lot there, like the archive of the soil and the sort of social layer of soil.
Yeah, also, but another sort of important aspect of this is also the mixing of the different soil samples from the different sites. I mean, it's really hard to know because we didn't do any any kind of analysis of the microorganisms or the different root systems and fungi and stuff like that that ended up into the different samples. But do you think that sort of contributes to the project? I mean, maybe on a more on a metaphorical level, but also on a practical level. Or like, what can we see in the images that can we know where the different things come from, in a way?
No,
maybe there might be someone here that could actually answer that.
No, I think there's others who are more equipped to answer that. But for me, on a sort of more conceptual layer, it is this sort of interconnectedness, connectedness of these sort of spaces, and that they don't have to be sort of physically connected. They can be connected with ideas or other sort of notions. So it's also the way of like visualizing, like we have been talking about today, like the soil is kind of another biome. We can't go into the soil and sort of investigate it without disturbing it. So it's also connected to the sort of agency and like trying to give it a voice in a sense, or a form, or connect it to the sort of digital discourse and letting it, well, in the sort of space we created. We should say a bit about this space actually, because we also did some changes to the gallery space. So there is this is sort of not an ecosystem, not a closed ecosystem as per se, but it's a humidity system that
it's at least climate control.
Yeah, it's a climate control, and which is also partly based on the aspiration of the guests in the space, as we collect vapor from the air in the gallery, and we use that to humidify the sculptures.
Yeah, and then recirculate that through a dehumidifier, and then channeling it back into like a closed, at least mimicking a closed.
Performing,
like we heard earlier today with biospheres, right? So in at least in a sense, it's a model for that, even maybe not 100% functional, right? Yeah. Okay.
I just wanted to talk a bit more about like a difficulty with this kind of project is that you have like the gallery space, which is usually like a dry, also very limited in terms of time, and as you allured to in the beginning, that this project is still ongoing. As you can see in the images, that there's some images that comes after a month, and then you have had some development. Some of the seeds or spores have begun to germinate, but then after a year, the last pictures there are taken like a month or two ago, I think. Yeah, they're residing still in Bergen.
Yeah, so it's pretty much like 18 months ago since the process of populating the sculpture started, right? Yeah, and also, I mean, the plan further is to fix those sculptures by firing them in a kiln to make them permanent. Because there's also clay in the mixture, together with all the different minerals and biological material and everything. I guess also it's not a secret, right? That, I mean, sort of the plan is also to return them to those sites. Yeah. At least some of the sculptures, to give them like a future life as
You can say like Easter eggs for future archaeologists.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
But it also ties into another thing which I think is very important for me in this project, and we talked about it a bit yesterday actually, like these sort of in a way broken tools of our society, to say it a bit like pompous, but all these sort of terms or words we use to sort of analyze our relationship with what we often call nature, and you have like our world and the natural world, and we have like this. It doesn't feel like these words work very well anymore. So we're like trying to come up with some notions of maybe like these sort of semi-permeable spaces or membranes, and that we can sort of poke holes a bit in this hard borders we have made also between like our sort of city spaces, which should be controlled and regulated, and what is perceived as like nature and wilderness outside. And these sculptures, they also end up as these kind of porous structures in a sense.
Sorry about that. That's
wow.
The sound was off.
Yeah. These sort of porous structures. So I really like to hear this, the last talk about the sort of porousness of soil and the actual sort of measured area like being huge.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with. I mean, yeah, we talked about tools yesterday. But I mean, and you mentioned traditional knowledge here earlier, and I mean, that can be many things. And I know that you mean it in maybe a specific way, but I just want to maybe try to bring it back to that that notion of relating to the world through tools is also a way of creating agency, right? It's a way for us to interact with the world around us using ingenuity, imagination, creativity, and all these things, right? But it also lends itself to sort of like actually to this possibility of failure in a sense, because the term utopia is a very anthropocentric way of looking at the idea of progress, right? That either we come from utopia or we're going to utopia, but we've never been there and we'll never get there, right? That was really not a good question. Did that make sense at all?
No, but maybe I just talk about something. No,
that's the risk of a conversation when it's not scripted, right?
Yeah,
So.
no, but failure, and well, what struck my mind when we talked about this sort of like the anthropocentric, it's actually like an anecdote in a sense. Because I'm not necessarily, like it can be useful, talking about the Anthropocene also, but I also like the complexity of counter-arguments there, and like this argument that, well, in some sense you could maybe like place the Anthropocene before Homo sapiens, like which is also kind of Earthworks, like Homo erectus, and how they sort of burnt forests and pastures and to make better food, and like that, in a sense, they were in a way the first animal, like a monkey, that really affected the earth, and you can see this sort of scorched layer, and that in a way the Anthropocene in that sense could start before we were human. And I just like the complication of that argument in a sense.
Okay, I like it too, but I think that maybe this is an idea. Maybe before we sort of like get too far out ut på vidda, so to speak, and Maybe it's time to sort of like maybe open up for some reflections or questions from the audience.
Yeah.
To sort of bring us back down to earth a little bit.
Good idea. So,
do you have any questions? For
I was just curious about the selection of the membrane that you put underneath your printed sculptures, whether that was deliberate. I don't, for people who, so because I come from architecture, I know exactly what it is. It's called a delta membrane, and it's what we use to, I actually think in architectural detailing, when you think about the nature-culture divide and the challenges and the question of soil in relation to our built environment, the delta membrane is kind of important.
Yeah.
It's like the fortress wall that we use to constantly reinforce that we are not nature, actually.
Yeah. No, you're quite right. It's chosen specific for that reason, that it's the actual sort of watertight membrane between sort of perceived our spaces and the rest, in a sense. And it's also a ubiquitous sort of feature of any sort of more or less urban space, but it's not something you see. It's always hidden in the sort of subsurface infrastructure. So it was also a way to sort of bring that up. But it also has a very specific and practical function within that building, which is some sort of an accommodation we had to do so we didn't sort of ruin the floor of the gallery. So it serves the same purposes in a sense to separate the dry space from the.
It became important for us through. There was a long discussion. Well, how can we protect the floor? We need to protect the floor, and then basically not hiding it. That's exactly what we're doing. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I think your work is really beautiful. Thank you very much for showing us. I was just curious about, because I didn't really get if you were mixing the soil with a binder or with the clay or with anything else in order to kind of keep it both workable within the 3D printer and to keep the structure. And also about this, if you're going to fire it in the kiln afterwards, how is it going to, have you been testing with that, and how is it holding the structure?
Yeah.
And if you're mixing with other materials and your thoughts of doing that or not doing that, if you're...
Thank you for the question. So in this show, I have mixed with other bulk materials, both sand but also binder. I've worked also with like pure soils, but then you have to sort of choose your site based on sort of soil quality and clay content, etc. And we wanted to work with specific sites, not chosen because they had like great soil for 3D printing qualities. So in a way the site has been sort of selected for its sort of social or urban context, and then the sense of like this soil will contain sort of spores, microorganisms and seed, and it's sort of been sort of to animate the mixture in a sense. So yeah, it's mixed with both binders, and I don't have a very like dogmatic approach to it. So some of the binders is actually a residue from the last show at Entrée. They had been using a bunch of sands, so instead of throwing it out, we kind of just reused that. I had also brought with me some clay and also some soil from Tromsø. So it's also clay from Tromsø, like natural clay, blue clay. And there was another component, the firing part. So I have fired some sculptures made in this sense, and what you end up is with, well, depending on how you burn it, but like if you burn it like a sort of natural or reducing atmosphere, you'll end up re-emitting sort of the CO2 from all the organic material. So you will have a sort of a porous structure, like full of cavities. like micro surfaces in a sense. Yeah. We haven't. I haven't tried to glaze fire it. It's something we also want to test to see if the sort of minerals in that specific soil also sort of can give some kind of interesting glaze to it. Yeah.
It is. This is a discussion that, I mean, has already been started just a little bit in terms of talking to. I know some ceramicists who have a little bit of experience with using a wide diversity of materials from nature in terms of selecting some temperatures to do the testing at least. But yeah, it'll be interesting. Yeah, worst case scenario, it just melts into a puddle in the bottom of the kiln. So.
We have time for a short question, and then we have to move on. If it's yeah, of course.
Yes. Hello, thank you. I don't know if this is a short question or not, but I was wondering about you had kind of a fear of nostalgic traps or the subjective. I was kind of wondering what you meant by that, because I guess you're using this kind of more futuristic tool, but the result is still quite organic, I guess you could say, and also quite reminiscent of kind of traditional ceramic techniques. So I was just kind of wondering about what that meant.
Yeah. Yeah, I wasn't maybe so clear about it because it's also connected to other works, which is not shown here today. But like one notion that I've been sort of been using to sort of guide my work has been a concept I've called like a Stone Age sci-fi, or sort of like collapsing time in a sense. And I think it's also like this sort of what's it called? In religion you call it not fundamentalism, or like this idea that things should be sort of pure and that there is a traditional way to do it, and or that it belongs to a specific discipline or school, or it is kind of trying to evade some of those trappings in a sense. Like I work quite a lot with ceramicists, and I really do love their like deep knowledge on the matter. But I sometimes also maybe I don't want to step on any toes, but it's sometimes it's also you can get kind of locked in certain sort of traditions. But I'm also been working like with other sort of. I think there's so much sort of great knowledge that hasn't been in a way good, that it's also good that it hasn't been sort of codified yet, but like traditional knowledge connected to sort of both soil and ocean, and how you can sort of use different materials and plants, and a lot of this knowledge has been sort of on its way to sort of die out. Like the older generations using it hasn't always like passed it on. But I think like a lot of this can be sort of reevaluated today, and you can see sort of the merits of these practices in a sense. And in that sense, I mean like one very like particular example I could give is sort of I'm from northern Norway. That's sort of that's also Sápmi. It's a Sami area, and a lot of sort of what it means to be a Sami has sort of been codified with this sort of this is what the like traditional Samis do, whereas I would argue, if you like dig deeper, like a lot of it is connected to not the sort of the actual like material inheritance, but the sort of an approach to that material. Call it indigenuity or whatnot. And a very concrete example of that is like I used to work in the fence with this older Sami in Senja. It's an island, so it's another climate than you will have in Finnmark on the sort of vidda, which is a cold and dry area, and on the coast, in the coastal climate, being locked area around, he used different materials. Like he wouldn't use like reindeer skins to sit on. He would use empty wood like bags put inside other wood bags, because it's such a humid place, so you need something that was light and dry, and it didn't matter if it was like plastic. So that's kind of, it's a long-winded way of trying to respond to the whole question of avoiding nostalgia, I guess. I don't know if that makes sense. I might have struggled a bit there. Yep.
Maybe you're out of time?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for this conversation. We love to listen to you.